If I asked you to name the most haunted house in London, you probably wouldn't pick Berkeley Square as your location. Yet for almost a century, number 50 Berkeley Square had quite the supernatural reputation. It's part of the Grosvenor Estate in Mayfair, built in the mid-18th century by architect William Kent. Famous residents of the square have included Horace Walpole, Winston Churchill, William Pitt the Younger, Charles Rolls, co-founder of Rolls Royce, and Harry Gordon Selfridge. But was it actually haunted? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This is the final episode of 2023. Let us just hope that 2024 is a better year. And before I forget, because let's be honest, I probably will otherwise, I wanted to tell you which plant was going to be sponsoring this episode, Sesame Street style. So this episode is brought to you by the olive, which obviously represents peace, which I think was basically the best thing I could think of for this particular time of the year and everything else. So obviously we have passed Christmas now. I hope that you had a good one, or at least a festive period, whatever it is that you happen to be doing. We are also past the winter solstice as well, so in the northern hemisphere at least it does mean we're going to be getting a tiny bit more daylight every day. Obviously if you're in the southern hemisphere you just had the summer solstice, so I hope you had a good one. But anyway, we are having a look at number 50 Berkeley Square, which is a really, really weird story in quite a lot of ways. And if you've heard it before, then hopefully you'll find something interesting in all of this as well. I did actually end up tumbling down the rabbit hole that is the British newspaper archives for this one. And it was amazing how far afield some of this stuff was actually getting reported, like outside of London. Like, who knew that they actually cared that much in, the South Shields, which is up here, about what was happening in this fancy Mayfair Square. But, I suppose it's still newsworthy. But the thing is, it's also difficult to tell when it actually came out. So a lot of people try and date it to 1879 when a magazine called Mayfair, which is not the men's magazine that's still available, but when this older magazine first broke the story. But we actually have to go back to 1872 to find out what happened. And I'm going to actually start with that before I explain what the legend is, because then it helps to explain what the story of Berkeley Square actually involves. So in March 1872, the Spiritualist magazine reprinted a story from the South London Courier, and they had done so for a very particular reason. Now, apparently this story was authenticated in a private circle of friends, although as always, names are omitted. And according to this particular version that the Spiritualist magazine had reprinted, a couple had taken a house in Berkeley Square ahead of their wedding, and apparently the events that followed were only a few months before the article was published. Once the agreement was confirmed, the agent then told them that the house had a ghost, seemingly confined to a particular room. That's the kind of thing you'd think you would tell someone beforehand, but there we go. The couple weren't actually put off by this, but the mother of the bride offered to sleep in the offending room. As she put it, she was in the house anyway because she was there to oversee the arrival of their furniture. And as she kept 2 or 3 servants, she wasn't sleeping in the house alone, so everybody seemed to think that this was a perfectly fine thing to do. So she went to bed in this apparently haunted room, and all seemed well. The following morning, the woman didn't appear as usual, so the servants went to fetch her, and they found her dead in bed, still staring at the ceiling, her face apparently a mask of sheer terror. The servants fetched a doctor who couldn't immediately find a cause of death, other than to say he believed she'd had some kind of shock. Now, the couple were understandably sad about the death, but they also refused to believe that it was related to the supernatural. So the husband then offered to sleep in the room to disprove the stories of ghosts. His wife only agreed as long as she could sleep in the corridor outside the room, armed with a pair of pistols and accompanied by a bulldog. 2 policemen agreed to sleep in another nearby room, and the husband said he would ring a bell twice if the ghost did appear and he needed the policeman. Now, quite what he expected the policeman to do about a ghost is never explained, and indeed I'm not quite sure what the wife thought she was going to do with a bulldog and 2 pistols, but of course remember they didn't believe that there was anything ghostly going on, so I suppose we can probably let them off the hook for that. But at around midnight, the bell rang twice and the wife burst into the room. To her horror, her husband lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, and quite dead. Now, the newspaper assured readers the story was true. Writers at the Spiritualist magazine wrote to J.E. Muddock, their newspaper's editor, for some more information so they could check how accurate the story was. Now, Muddock replied, saying he couldn't give them any names of the people involved in the story, but he could vouch for the accuracy of the facts. And while he couldn't give them the couple's names, they were free to use his. And then later Muddock reported back to the Spiritualist again to say that the verdict of a coroner's inquest was, and I quote, "died by the visitation of God," end quote. And I find that story really irritating because nowadays you would never really get a news story run of, we can't tell you the details, but you'll just have to take my word for it that it's true. That's just silly. But anyway, in a variation of the tale, the Illustrated Police News reported strange rappings coming from the house at all hours. And in 1876, they reported that a gentleman apparently decided the noises had a rational explanation and somehow managed to get permission to stay overnight in the house. He slept in the room most afflicted by the noises, with his valet in a nearby room. Now, the valet found the gentleman dead the following morning. Meanwhile, the noises continued and people began to see a strange figure flittering about. So this is where it all starts to kind of catch on, slowly I think, in the public consciousness. Because by 1879 the house was empty and rumours persisted that the house was haunted. Now, no one knew who, what or why it would be haunted, but Mayfair magazine caught on to the legend either way. Now, we have to go back in time slightly. In either the 1850s or 1860s, the sources disagree as to which one, and Mr. Myers took possession of the property. As an eccentric recluse, he withdrew to a single room. Now, rather than care for the whole house, he let the rest of the house go to rack and ruin. Some said his bride jilted him the day before his wedding, and he'd slowly descended into madness. He wandered the house during the night, and people assumed the bobbing candlelight inside the darkened house to be that of a ghost. Apparently, when he was summoned to court for not paying tax, the judge even commented on the house being known as haunted in 1873. Now, that does rather suggest that the story reported by the South London Courier in 1872 about the newlyweds who'd just taken the house might be false, particularly if Mr. Myers had already been in the house since the mid-1860s. And I think this is probably where the legend starts to take effect, really, because you've then got this eccentric man wandering around in his mansion at night, so people can just see a single light moving around, but you've also then got this house, which essentially seems to go to rack and ruin under Mr. Myers' possession. Now, the stories weren't just concerned with an eccentric recluse wandering his house at night, because they were actually fixated on the room that was reputed to be fatal to anyone who slept there, and this is the same room from that story published in 1872. So it's fascinating that it basically takes this magazine 7 years to catch on. But by 1880, the legend had spiralled even further. So at one point, a story had circulated that Lord Lytton had kept a vigil in the haunted room, and he'd loaded his guns with silver sixpences, obviously using silver because that's clearly what you use to fire at anything supernatural, and he had shot at something which apparently had dropped to the ground. But by morning, all he found was floorboards damaged by gunfire. But he did survive, though, I should point out. Next, the absentee owner apparently gave the room to a maid to use as a bedroom. Soon after she took the room, the maid's terrified screams woke the staff during the night. They burst into her room to find her standing in the centre of the room, completely rigid and staring madly in front of her. The maid never regained her senses and lived out the rest of her days caught up in her madness, and therefore couldn't explain what it was that she'd actually seen. Other versions of the story say she was actually struck dead, so again, they don't agree on anything. An unnamed gentleman insisted upon staying in the now locked room. In one version of the legend, the owner found the guest dead on the floor. In another, the gentleman survived, but like the maid, never regained his senses. And according to Mayfair magazine, many people had died in the same way in the room. You do start to find a lot of crossover where an unnamed maid is either killed or rendered insensible by the room, and then the same thing happens to a gentleman, and it all just starts to get a little bit muddled. Then in a named way, Lord Selkirk took the house in 1884, and the newspapers reported that people had been making wagers that he would soon quit the house. Oddly, they referred to a little old woman in grey who they claimed had the house to herself for a long time and objects to the intrusion of earthly tenants, which I thought was really interesting that everybody else is talking about this specifically haunted room, and yet this particular newspaper article decides to actually invent a grey lady for the house. So that one's never really pursued any further, so I have no idea what happened with that particular line of thinking. but newspapers claimed that only an elderly man and woman lived in the house acting as caretakers, yet they couldn't access the room, not actually having a key for it. Only a mysterious and seemingly nameless person had the key, and apparently he would turn up once every 6 months, he would lock the couple in the basement, and then he would spend hours in the haunted room. Some rumours went further and claimed it was actually the owner himself practising black magic in the room. The stories began to mount up. A man took the house and his teenage daughters apparently complained of an animal smell in the house. A maid encountered one guest carrying his room screaming, "Don't let it touch me," before he then died in the same room. People claimed a child tortured in the nursery now haunted the house. Other people say an earlier owner kept his mad brother locked in the upstairs room. Other people say a girl threw herself from its window to avoid being assaulted by her uncle, and yet more people claimed a Scottish maid was tortured in the room. It all gets really rather silly with the number of stories that just get piled onto this one building. And then beyond that, an urban legend arose in the 1920s about 2 sailors who apparently broke into the house while it stood empty. They were looking for a place to sleep, and this abandoned house in rather a nice neighbourhood seemed ideal. The story claimed that one sailor found something so awful in the house that he hurled himself from an upstairs window to escape it, only to land on the pointed railings below, and the other sailor either goes mad in some versions or escapes to tell the tale in others. But it is worth knowing with that one that Elliot O'Donnell actually invented the legend. Now, the Illustrated Police News did actually raise the prospect of an infamous murder in 1758 in Bruton Street, some 3/4 of a mile from Berkeley Square, as a potential cause for where the stories first came from. Now, in this particular story of murder, Sarah Metyard, a rather cruel widow by all accounts, employed young girls to knit mittens for ladies. She sorely mistreated them and even had her daughter beat one of them to death. Metyard hid the girls' remains in a hole in Chick Lane. The poor victim's sister was Metyard's next victim after she announced she knew her sister hadn't run away but was dead. Eventually, Metyard's daughter went to work for someone else who took a house on Berkeley Square. Metyard and her daughter had furious screaming matches in the street, during which they both accused each other of being the Chick Lane ghost, and the truth finally came out, and both women were hanged for murder. The Illustrated Police News suggested that the talk of murder and the accusations of ghosts clung to Berkeley Square due to the screaming matches, rather than Bruton Street, where the murders actually happened. Now, the Illustrated Police News does also discuss Myers' peculiar behaviour, and apparently Myers wouldn't be seen by anyone and lived elsewhere while renovations and alteration work was underway at the house. Servants had to be locked in their rooms by 10 p.m, and Myers would come to the house at midnight to see the progress of the works. And the newspaper notes that crowds assembled every night to watch his light bobbing around the house. And this, they think, is what gave rise to the idea it was haunted. Now, they actually said he died in 1874, and only servants remained to care for the property while it made its way through a tortuous legal process towards a new owner. That said, the servants confirmed they'd never actually heard anything untoward or seen anything in the house. Now, here's the rub where number 50 Berkeley Square is concerned. There were letters and notes and queries that discussed the death, but they only ever did so with second or third-hand accounts. No one actually personally knew any of the victims, and indeed a lot of them are never actually named if they even existed at all. Other letters debunked the rumours, particularly from maids who worked for Mr. Myers, and also a butler from the 1850s who scoffed at stories of ghosts. And then, of course, you've got the piece in 1876 in the Illustrated Police News, well before the story even really broke, which confirms that the servants thought the whole thing was utter nonsense. Now, there seems to be no real connection between Mr. Myers' eccentricity, which was apparently provoked by the trauma of his being jilted, and the later tales of grotesque creatures and instant madness, yet the legends became so notorious that one rumour claimed that the owner only charged a peppercorn rent to their new tenants at the end of the 19th century, but a huge forfeit awaited them should they quit the lease before 3 years were up. Now, John O'London at the Tatler actually suggested in 1906 that the ghost story began in 1871, while the house was shut up for year after year, and it's entirely likely that this is actually the cause of the haunted house stories, not anything else, because it's most likely that the stories of hauntings accrued in the building due to its dilapidated state, rather than because it was actually haunted. So the eccentric behaviour of Myers and his bobbing around the house with a candle and whatnot gave rise to the suspicion of a phantom, but it only really was able to do so because people thought that the house had been abandoned. And obviously people seem to forget the fact that the servants were still living there as well. But the sordid tales associated with the haunted room could basically have just simply been an attempt at fanciful storytelling that essentially took root. And they certainly captured the imagination. Apparently a gentleman called at the house late one night in 1872, wanting to see for himself if the house was haunted. He ended up being charged with being drunk and disorderly, although he actually denied the charge and insisted he was stone cold sober. But the magistrate fined him 10 shillings for the potential disturbance. And you do have to wonder, wow, how curious was this man that he just walked up to the house in the dead of night and rang the bell? Who was he expecting to answer the door? This is what you have to wonder. And also think about it, that's in 1872, so well before the Mayfair magazine ever broke the story in 1879, people were already aware of this as being a potentially haunted house. But obviously that was also while it was under the possession of Mr. Myers. But I do want to leave you with one particular point, because the house passed into the hands of the Marx brothers, antiquarian booksellers, in 1938. And not only has no further activity ever been reported in the house, but the firm resolutely denies the existence of any first-hand accounts at all. So just think, next time you see a dilapidated house that decays a little more every day, it may not have a sordid or dark history after all. Those tall tales and legends might only exist in the imagination, and it may just be a lonely house that yearns to be loved. I hope you enjoyed that. If you've heard the stories of Berkeley Square before, please do feel free to let me know what you think. You can obviously comment in all the usual places. We can have a discussion about it if you want, but I hope that you enjoyed that. I haven't 100% sure decided what I'm going to do in January yet. It's going to be either something to do with fairies or sort of folklore of like moorland. It's going to be one of the two. I haven't decided yet. So if you've got a particular favourite, then obviously let me know. Although I'll probably end up doing both of them, so it doesn't really matter. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this particular theme of London ghosts. It's certainly been quite a lot of fun for me. And also, as always, thank you for all of your support this year. Whether you've told a friend about a podcast, whether you've left a review, which is always really helpful, whether you've bought me a coffee or supported on Patreon, or just shared anything on social media of mine, all of it helps, and all of it helps to get these kind of stories into circulation with a little bit of critical thinking in there as well. So I do hope that you have an excellent new year. Don't forget there is an episode from a couple of years ago, I think it was, of New Year folklore. So if there's anything that you would like to do for New Year, then obviously check that out for some ideas. And there's also the tradition of first footing, which yes, I will be doing. And as always, I will go live on Instagram while I'm doing that at like 5 to midnight on the 31st of December. So if you want to see basically me making an idiot of myself on Instagram live, then just follow me at Icy Sedgwick and that'll pop right up. But anyway, without any further ado, again, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the new year. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.